Welcome to our second Australian Boarding School Summit, and thank you for joining us. The Summit is the culmination of our year on the road. We spend most of the year travelling around the country doing in-person events with boarding schools from across the eastern states of Australia. Depending on venues, we've hosted up to 44 schools at any event. They allow for country families to come and talk to a broad selection of schools all under one roof. It sets the stage for their shortlisting and final decision making. With those numbers of schools, it also shows you, the families, that Australian boarding schools are committed to our rural kids. Our summit discussions are inspired by chats we have with families at our in-person events. And this year, the conversations were plentiful and heartfelt. We're here because we want to have open, honest and authentic conversations that support families, whether they're thinking about boarding school as an option or whether they're already at boarding school. We want families, wherever they live, to have access to our resources, and that is why our Australian Boarding School Summit will always remain an online event. Which leads me into our first discussion panel for today. Country culture in the boarding house, can we put a value on it? How does it impact the school as a whole? With over 86% of boarding students across Australia coming from rural, regional and remote areas, it's a pretty important discussion to have. Families often arrive wide-eyed and anxious at our in-person events, wanting to make a good impression, though they remain completely unaware of the asset that they arrive with, their country child. For this discussion, we're joined by our four panellists. Ben Chadwick is the Director of Boarding at the King's School. King's is one of the oldest and indeed largest boarding schools in Australia, with a very steeped history of educating country boys. Ben teaches senior economics, business studies and junior commerce. He coaches rugby, tennis and cricket as well. He's been an assistant boarding house master and a master in charge of sport. He's been an academic year coordinator, an officer in the King's School Cadet Corps, and most recently a senior boarding house master for the last 7 years. The King's School, while steeped in tradition and country culture, is also a culturally diverse school, and Ben, as the Director of Boarding, ensures that pastoral care remains a driving force of his role. Natalie Kenny joins us from Clermont in central North Queensland, about 1,000 kilometres north of Brisbane in fact. She's currently the CFO of the family farm operation, LPC Agriculture, and has just completed 16 years of teaching her children via School of Distance Education, with her youngest child headed off to Brisbane this year. She has a thorough understanding of rural and remote education and the complex issues that can arise, with a Bachelor of Behavioural Studies under her belt, 4 children going to 2 different boarding schools, as well as many years working with the ICPA as a counsellor and publicity officer. She's got plenty of experience to draw on. The Kennys have sent their children to 2 different boarding schools, one co-ed and quite a small cohort of boarders, including international boarders, and the other a single-sex larger school. Hailing from the Central West District of New South Wales, Fiona Aveyard is a 5th-generation primary producer. Fiona's is a mixed family farming operation of approximately 5,000 hectares. Enterprises include cereal cropping, merino sheep, prime lamb production. In addition, Fiona founded the award-winning paddock-to-plate business Outback Lamb. She's a 2023 Nuffield Scholar and has achieved industry recognition by being a finalist in the 2019 ABC Condinan Farmer of the Year, along with the 2020 Lambition Industry Innovation Awards and the 2019-2020 Shine Awards. Fiona sits on the New South Wales Ag Ministers Advisory Group, AgMag. She was a mentor in the Drought Resilience Leaders Mentoring Program and advocates for the red meat industry in her role as MLA Meat Ambassador. Fiona is also a mother of boarders, and as an ex-boarder herself, she's witnessed many changes. Our final panellist is Martin Gooding. He's been at Knox Grammar for decades and been part of the process of change in the culture of boarding schools. Martin was responsible for the research and subsequent oversight of the implementation of next generation boarding at Knox Grammar, located on Sydney's North Shore. Now primarily focused on relationships within our past, present and future boarding communities, local and overseas, Martin finds himself travelling extensively in rural areas and overseas to connect with families and students. He is a stalwart of boarding school education in Australia and believes strongly in the country culture of the boarding house. Welcome and enjoy this discussion. We're really here to talk about country culture in the boarding house and what that brings to a school community. And we want to talk here to all different sizes and types of schools. Natalie, one of our guests from North Queensland or Central North Queensland, has educated children at 2 different schools, one of which is smaller boarding cohort, co-educational and a number of international students. And what I really want to dive into here is the culture within the boarding school community and the broader school community and how that is lifted by our rural country kids coming in. So perhaps, Nat, would you like to start off and speak to us about your experience of sending kids to those schools in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, I guess to start with, our big decision to send the kids to Brisbane, we do have a lot of great boarding schools up in northern and central Queensland, but our big decision to send the kids down to Brisbane was so that they got outside the box a little bit. They'll always have their country friends up here. So I guess for us, it was about broadening the horizon and meeting kids that weren't country kids. So they went down to those schools, and both the schools our kids are at, neither of them have huge country cohorts. But what we found when they got there is that our kids and the other rural kids at there, they're not a huge part of the boarding house, but they are considered to be really special and a bit of a novelty. And a lot of the other kids were just fascinated by their life. And we've actually had a lot of those urban kids and international kids visit us on school holidays. So I guess what it did for our kids was make them realise that they lived in a pretty special part of the world and they'd had a unique upbringing. I don't think before they went to boarding school they realised how lucky they were in some regards.
That they appreciated that fully.
Yeah.
And being able to bring the kids home too, to where you're from, particularly those international kids. I mean, what an experience for them and for you.
Oh, absolutely. So our girls have brought home kids from Hong Kong, who've been raised in Hong Kong, whose parents are pilots, a lot of pilots, and go to St. Peter's. And that was fascinating. These kids have been brought up on a tiny island, with millions of people. So to come here, and now our kids have these friends all over the world. They're travelling all over the world. They've got contacts in every corner of the globe.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Martin, I'll go to you next, because Knox traditionally, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the boarding house was rather diverse in culture and where the kids came from. And is that changing now with a greater amount of country kids, or do you still try to keep the balance? Where does Knox sit?
We've always had a strong rural community, but we have had overseas boarders since the beginning of the school. But basically the balance for us is around about 65% local, rural, and about 30 to 35% from overseas. And that's a really nice balance, because we want that diversity because we live in a pretty diverse city in itself. We want the cultures interacting. We want, as Natalie said, the overseas boys to experience Australian life and the Australian boys to experience contact with boys from lots and lots of different cultures. We had our own experience during the pandemic, obviously, with our overseas boys stuck here for 3 years. And a number of those lived during that time on farms of our rural families, which is an extraordinary compressed experience out of the pandemic. But it did reflect the fact that we have always had a diverse community in our boarding, but a very strong commitment to around about 65% rural boys from various parts of mostly New South Wales that's been the aim for us, even through all of our transformations of boarding. That's been our aim and what we've committed to. It's
and when you're talking about that's your aim, that to try and maintain that balance at 65%. Are you able to speak to the reason for that? Is that because...
Yeah, look, it's very important. There's two sides to that. And one of it is the fact that every study shows that the further you get from from metropolitan areas, the more problematic education can become. So one part of this balance is a strong, if you like, social or philosophical commitment, which becomes a financial commitment as well, to rural education. We've always had boys from the country, and it becomes harder and harder. One of our old timers told me that when he first went to Knox, his father sold 6 cows. Well, tell me what you have to sell off the farm now to get a boy through a boarding school in Sydney with Kings, Knox, or any of them. And so part of it is a strong, and I think Kings would share this as well, that there's an incredibly strong commitment to rural education, to trying to provide as much access and opportunity for boys to come to Knox, to experience a Knox education, like the kid from Turramurra or wherever, or indeed Hong Kong. That's part of it. The other side of the coin, which Natalie was reflecting on and Ben would reflect on, is the fact that the country boys bring something unique. They do. There's no two ways about it. And it's not the manure on the RMs that's the unique bit. These boys, they have an outlook on life. They are very fiercely independent in some ways, and in other ways, not at all independent. But they bring a really nice outlook that does, if you like, it infects the school like a virus. It far outweighs the number of them. Their influence is widespread, and that part of it is very much a part of our commitment as well, to experience that. And that's really important to us. And Fiona will tell you what her boys bring here and so on like that.
Yeah, well, we'll go to you, Fiona.
Oliver obviously provided something to Kings.
He certainly did. Fiona, can you speak to how you see that country culture play out in the schools that your children are at, and Lily having finished last year? Do you see, as Martin speaks, that it infects that whole school community?
I do. I think it sort of goes back to when you're looking at schools for your children and what school's going to suit them. And one of the things that I've probably learned more in the last 6 years of being involved with boarding schools is that the schools are very much in the business of education. So they're all looking, they're positioning in a marketplace that's, and competing in some ways for particularly in that border crowd, but it's also you'll find schools that really resonate with you for whatever reason because of the way that they sit. And we were looking for schools that had certainly diversity, but also enough kids that yours could have that choice of friends, but not too many that they sort of disappeared. But I have changed my opinion a lot on size with experience, but I was worried early on. I didn't want it to be too big. And so then as you sort of go on and and you're looking at the schools, they very much, the country kids bring with them a sense of community, and it's not always when you're looking for maybe a good bargain or a bit of a deal or something like that, if your kid's not hugely academic or not the most sporting, or they don't fit into a niche that's immediately going to get a scholarship, it's but they bring something, a richness that is often innately connected to country kids, and you want to kind of, I don't want to say sell them, but you know what I mean? Like you want to pitch what they're bringing. And it's a difficult thing to do when their resume at 11 years of age doesn't read quite as richly as maybe kids who have been exposed to a lot more and had a lot more opportunities. And I do remember Martin and then another principal, I think at Winona, saying to me that if they could make boarding the core of the school, that filters out. And because those boarding kids bring with them a sense of community and just that willingness we're moving into a world that's often quite privileged, and our kids are used to doing stuff for their wider community. And if we can sort of infect that, as Martin so nicely put it, with the other kids, that suddenly, where their whole life they've been a little bit hothoused, their parents do everything for them, everything's been about that child, but the school's jobs is to really round them out and make them great men and women and contributing human beings. And the borders, I think, really assist with that, because they come with that already, and they understand that you give and that you do things and you contribute. And if they can have an influence on that wider community, then that's only a positive for that school.
Yeah, you say that so beautifully. And Ben, with King's, the King's School in Sydney is a really traditional boarding school, and a large one at that. Do you find as a school, as a business of education, that there is a value put on that country spirit, culture, call it whatever you want, that when it comes into a school to hopefully infect?
Absolutely. No, Fiona, you hit the nail on the head there. Very much so. We traditionally were, I suppose, very border heavy. Back in the day, we had about 800, and then we had 200 day boys. That's flipped on its head a bit. But the school's part of the strategic plan is to maintain that country connection. And similar to Martin's, we've got about 70% was our goal for rural regional families. Our internationals are only around about sort of 10%, and the rest we sort of draw on from Metro Sydney. But ultimately, I think we all agree that the borders set the tone and the culture of schools, particularly if they're a bigger group. And our boys do that, and they do it in a way which completely agree with Fiona, is it's all very much community minded. They're the first ones to put their hand up to be involved in service learning initiatives, or they're the first ones to lead the war cries, and the first ones to attend all the sporting events, and the first ones to drag along other people to sort of mudgy musters and things like that, which you get all these day boys, boarders, boys and girls mingling and really just sharing what they've grown up with and being part of that community. We find that incredibly valuable for our school. And not only the boys, but also, Tudor House, we've got co-ed. We sort of try and, it's a feeder school for us. We look at maintaining a really strong connection, because as they come into our Year 7 boarding contingent, they've already had this wonderful experience down, and they've had a couple of years of boarding. So they're ready to go. And you can just see the ones who have just arrived really sort of watching their every move, which sometimes cannot be the right thing, but mostly it's the right thing, and really learning from these boys. And they set that tone for Year 7, and it just sort of infects everybody as they come in, as we're talking about. So yeah, I completely agree in terms of culture and in terms of what schools are trying to do. We're as Knox are, and as many other schools are, very culturally diverse. We draw on a lot from our Parramatta area, so a lot of Chinese, Indian families, and we're really, it's obviously a true reflection of the global world. And so we make sure that we have international students in our boarding houses leading the charge as well in regards to sharing their culture to our country families. So we do, which I think is important, because as much as these country families are coming in and sharing their culture and sharing their community spirit, it can be pretty daunting for some other boys if they haven't had that sort of exposure. And so we work really hard on, as Martin put, blending them, working towards in creating an environment where everyone is benefiting from what they're bringing to our boarding communities. Parents are involved. It's obviously a team effort. And so we make sure that we host a lot of events. And we've got a director of community engagement, very similar to you, Martin, who, and we've now started a thing called the FAFers, the Family and Friends Association. So they tend to do a lot of faffing, but at the same time, they're terrific with regards to organising events and getting everybody together. So the boys see all that, and that just perpetuates into our boarding houses. And yeah, before you know it, you're having a wonderful time, sharing cultural stories, sharing community ideas, and just everyone's enjoying themselves.
Yeah. Because I was just about to say, that's changed. And what we're all experiencing is the fact that if you went back 20 years, we would be having a different conversation.
Absolutely.
And in fact, if you go back 20 years when then the overseas boys did not engage very much with the broader school. And the rural boys didn't engage much with the overseas boys. They came and a lot of them just went straight back home to the farms. But we don't live in that world anymore. We don't live in that world educationally, and we don't live in that world in terms of universities or opportunities. We don't live in that world. And so both Kings and us, because we've got more overseas students than Kings has, but the same principle involved is that the overseas boys must engage, and we have programs and processes and a cultural officer in place to ensure that the same involvement takes place with the overseas boys, so that they learn about rural learns about overseas, and they all, because they're all coming from different contexts, but their goals and aspirations are the same. And 20 years ago, they were not, but they are now, and moving forward. We talk about horizons. I mean, the horizon has just broadened. I mean, the pandemic showed us that there are no horizons in one sense. So the discussions we have with rural and overseas students become the same, but from different contexts. What we're looking at here is the fact that traditionally, and this has not changed, as Ben would say, again, is that what hasn't changed is the contribution of country kids to the culture of a school. That hasn't changed. That's not dissipated. It hasn't disappeared into diversity. It hasn't just gone. It is as strong as ever. And I think Ben would totally agree with that. It is strong as ever now than it was 30, 40, even 50 years ago. And that's wonderful that we've managed, schools like Knox and Kings and other schools have managed to bridge across to the modern global world and not lost that. And our rules have not lost it either.
Yes. It is really wonderful to see that, and to see that the appreciation of the diversity of culture, but that country spirit is joining in more, and vice versa. Natalie, you said something interesting before with the amount of schools that you and your husband could have chosen from. One of your reasons for sending them to Brisbane was not just that big city experience, but the cultural diversity that it offered your children. Could you speak to that a bit, and particularly at the schools that they were at?
Yeah, so and I don't come from a place of saying anything about our North Queensland schools. We've got, Townsville, Charters Towers, Mackay, Rockhampton, brilliant schools. And it's something to note that those schools probably have something, they don't have a lot of the international, because most of their boarding house, I would say a high 90% of their boarders are all country kids. And when I say country, I don't just mean off cattle stations. I mean off small rural towns, so I think they have issues like us, but it's just a different. They'll have different micro groups in their boarding house, but most of them are rural. And I guess our biggest thing was that we wanted our kids to experience more than just rural kids. And the schools that they're both at, the kids are from all over. Like, my kids have, friends from actually all over the world, which is fantastic. And I think where our children grew up, like, we're quite isolated. So my kids did distance education and went to school camps, but the only kids they met were kids, they were European background, they were English speaking, they had never met anyone really until they went to Brisbane that was outside what they looked like or sounded like. I doubt my kids had ever heard anyone speak another language before they went to Brisbane. So that was our main aim, to expose them to a world around them and to appreciate other people.
Yeah.
It's the same out where we live. They up until recently, when the backpacker initiative, to get the backpackers for their second year visa, and they had to spend time in regional Australia, most of the kids in my community would not have even met a person from another country. So, you know, as an initiative, that was wonderful, because then it carries that influence that has is then they get a passport. They're the first person in their family to ever get a passport and then travel and that type of thing. And prior to that happening, that's what we're trying to get out of boarding, is to get our kids away, exposed to different people, different worlds, people who travel, people who have traveled, people who might travel in the future. And it's, you know, it's so tied in with education, having an open mind. And most country people are involved in agriculture in some way. It's a global economy. That's our business. You need to have an understanding of the business you're in. And that sometimes just having a fishbowl approach in your local community doesn't meet those needs. So the more that they're exposed to, and the opportunities that arise because of that are you know, immeasurable, really.
Yeah, you're so right. I remember when Oliver finished in 2020, so the first year of the pandemic, and it was, you know, a frightening year in many respects, and schools were trying to navigate through how to handle that, and in lockdowns, and all school events were cancelled. But as things started opening up towards the end of the year, we were able to hold a Borders farewell, basically, privately. A few families got together and we held it privately at a function centre in Sydney. But one thing I'll never forget that arose out of organising that was I had contact with all of these families from overseas whose sons were at King's that I'd never met before. And I formed friendships just in organising that one event, and they were so incredibly grateful to the country parents for putting this on for their sons, because it was a whole of year experience, a whole of boarding year. We couldn't fit the day boys in under the number restrictions, but, you know, they had their own tables and seeing how, because we had never really seen that, how they all interacted with the other country boys and having their voice and their stage, and it all being together was one of the greatest highlights or benefits that came out of a pretty terrible situation in that first year of the pandemic. But Ben, I just want to go back to you for a minute with King's, and there is that long history of that rural association, and now with a more diverse Sydney, where we're seeing that increased population of our Sikh and Indian community and Chinese, Asian community coming in, and at King's, you still got the really strong numbers in the boarding. I've noticed King's have joined their boarding parent association with the parents and friends to now make FAFA. Are you finding there's more interaction between that country spirit and those diverse cultures that King's has?
Absolutely. And it's just it's immeasurable, the enjoyment everyone's getting out of it, and the fact that it's bringing these year groups together. But not only year groups, cross year groups as well. So our boarding's vertical. So when a boarding house holds an event, it's every year group, year 8 to 12. So at the beginning of the year, we'll have a big Kickstarter event where every single, whatever year you're in, you wear a different colour. And so everyone comes along and they know they can introduce themselves to somebody else in that year group. But just, I think it's also, as Martin touched on, and everyone else we're talking about global, our sort of thoughts at the moment are global thought leaders. That's what we're aiming for these boys to be. And if they're going to be that, they've got to be, particularly our boarders, coming from rural, remote areas, having never probably heard someone speak that foreign language. It can be a little bit sort of, wow, a little bit of a shock. So what we try and do is, as much as it is for our international boys, it's an interesting conundrum, but having that cultural diversity is only going to teach these boys from both backgrounds a lot more than they ever would learn before if they didn't have it. So we encourage it. We engage the boys in all sorts of different activities. I mean, just the other day we had year 11s doing their speeches for potential house leadership positions, of which Ollie did a very good one back in 2019, I remember, Fez. And one of the fellas had been rooming, one of our international boys had been rooming with a very rural young man. And in his speech, he basically thanked him for teaching him all about the Australian slang words, because this fellow had arrived and he's thinking, my gosh, what does crikey mean? And what does, oath, hello, all this sort of stuff that he's talking about. So he actually stood up and he was able to give his version of a couple of different colloquialisms from his background. And on the back of that, then our international boys would stand up and they'd present, right, and food brings all these kids together, as it does our communities and families, and it will forever. It's going to be, food's going to be one of those things, and that we'll be trading with all these wonderful people in the future from our farms. And our boys stand up and our international boys will stand up and say, right, we're going to go on a food safari, and we're going to go down to, we're going to go down to the best dumpling bar you've ever been to, and then around the corner we're going to do Korean fried chicken, and they will stand up and present to all our country kids who have probably never, they don't really, that's not their go-to meal. And before you know it, you've got this cross-cultural experience sitting in a dumpling bar down in Epping talking about where this food's come from and why it's so delicious. And then the boys go back, and then when we do big events at the school, we'll have, because of our multicultural population, there will be a dumpling bar, a food truck, and there will be a goslemi, and then all our boarders will take their parents along and introduce them to their friends. And it's just sort of, it's setting up really well, Martin. I think you'll agree that we have hung on to what's important, but we've also encouraged this wonderful understanding and education of cross-culture, which is going to benefit Australian farming and Australian networking in the future.
Oh,
yeah, certainly.
It's so true. Can I just say, Amanda, I remember handing Archie over to James Norman, who was in charge of the Core 4 group when we first arrived. And we're talking about how much the country boys bring, but they're certainly, a lot of the time, they're quite underdone as well in terms of their development. And I know that I handed James Archie and I was like, I'm really sorry, but my work here is not done. It's and Archie, just what Ben was saying, it's so true. He goes up to Wahroonga. He's I feel like we spend more at the sushi restaurants and the different, like, he's absolutely dived into the experiences that living in a city or even a village environment like Wahroonga brings, and having that responsibility and developing those life skills of going and trying new stuff. It's just, as a parent, it's all you want them to do.
Yeah, it's really important. Natalie, with the schools, so I believe that your girls, and one girl's still there at St. Peter's Lutheran at Brisbane. And where did you send your baby boy who went this year?
He went off to Brisbane Boys College, which is just
Brisbane Boys. What I really wanted to talk about too, with this spirit that the country kids bring, with the balance in a boarding house of whether you've got urban boarders, international boarders, country boarders, and that weekend leave. Natalie, what's your experience been with perhaps smaller boarding cohorts of rural and that emptying out of the boarding house on the weekend? Did that adversely affect, or did you find it made or encouraged your kids to make those friendships outside of the boarding house?
That's a good question, and it's a tricky one because both those boarding houses empty quite a bit on the weekends. Luckily, I've had quite social children, so they've quickly realised, and I went to boarding school and so did my husband, so our advice to our kids was make day friends quickly that will take you on leave. Hot tip. So they did do that, but yeah, it is tricky when they leave, especially in the early grades. I think those grades 7 and 8 takes a long time to form a friendship that's good enough to want to go out to someone's house on a weekend. So yeah, St. Peter's had a lot of weekly boarders in those first few years, so it was tricky for the girls. But I think the biggest thing that the St. Peter's community did is they had a very strong community, and the older girls mixed really, they enforced mixing from grade 12 to grade 7. So the grade 7 girls were not scared of the grade 10, 11, 12 girls. They were like big sisters. And I think that even though the numbers emptied out on the weekend, it didn't matter if all the grade 7 or 8s were gone. My girls were able to hang out and go to dinner with the grade 10s. It didn't.
They felt comfortable.
They were comfortable. They built this lovely culture, which they still have, around this interactive between the year levels, which I think helped.
Yeah.
So the other thing was sport. They had a policy that everyone had to, co-curricular, they say, co-curricular. My kids all played sport. So I think if your kids can play sport on a weekend, well, that's a whole day done, isn't it? A Saturday's full. So then you've only got a Sunday where you might be a bit lonely.
Yeah.
I'll say there as well, we as parents, we often love to see the activities that are scheduled for the kids on the Sunday and, you know, where are they going? What are they doing? You know, keeping them busy, all that sort of stuff. But sometimes it's, you know, good for kids to be a little bit bored as well, because then they get creative, they imagine, sometimes they make mischief, but, you know, they make new friends and they go and do what they need to entertain themselves, which is a good place to be in at times as well. And
yeah, that's a great point there about making friends, because when those kids are alone, they do talk to kids they don't normally talk to. They're not the kids they hang out with, and I think that is, you hit an nail.
Otherwise, they'd get complacent. You know, they're quite happy to sit within their dorm or their dining table or the, you know, their one or two immediate friends, but it's from those points of discomfort, you know, that they extend themselves, and it's again the richness, the diversity, the life skills that they acquire from being in boarding that take most of us a lot longer to develop, but they're working on them from a pretty young age, and it's all part of that rich picture that is being built as the you know, school molds the man or the woman into the the child we want them to become.
Yeah.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah.
Fiona, you said the country kids come a little bit underdone, but what they do bring with them is this, I think, very much a different relationship with technology, I think. And which is really important in our boarding houses to get that balance, as Martin would agree, and as parents of boarders, you'd agree. Obviously, it's part of their life, but at the same token, we don't want on the weekends, if they do have a bit of downtime, to just be entirely engrossed in technology. So country kids coming into boarding houses bring with them that wonderful ability to have that conversation and wonderful ability to as they look people in the eye and they engage and they talk about where they're from and what they do and how different it is to what they're doing at school. And those are the conversations which I listen to, and I really quite happy to hear on the weekends. We have a critical mass of about 25, 30 boys in each boarding house every weekend. And because they're all different age groups, it is that forced conversation, Natalie, in regards to older boys chatting to younger. And what we do is we take out that technology temptation. We say, right, we'll have some tech-free time. Off you go. And then up they go to our fields and play sport and just really interact in a really lovely way. Throw on top of that the cross-cultural part, and you get some boys up there who've never really shown much interest in certain sports, but all of a sudden they're being encouraged by country kids to come on, have a go. This is what, you know, we drive 6 hours to play a game of rugby every Sunday at home. This is what we're going to do. We could do it up here right now, so let's go and do it. And you get this wonderful sort of event happening where they're teaching them how to do certain things, and again, it's sort of the gone of you're not looking at someone from a different nationality, you're just looking at another human being, and you're looking at another member of your boarding house, and it's just a really lovely relationship.
Yeah, I think that's important, and agree with all those sentiments there, because one of the things that does worry parents is the weekend, because if you went back in, you know, their boys are not on Sunday waiting for Monday anymore. Schools, we have lots of activities, but Ben's right, by making the diverse community with these boys engaging, they are now interacting together. Like Ben, we have technology programs where there's no technology. We want the boys to invent things. The facilities of the school are now open on the weekends for boarders, whereas 20 years ago they weren't. And so there's a balance between downtime, boredom, and energy, and the boys need all of it. And out of that comes a real mutuality. And yeah, look, like Ben, you're not surprised anymore, but 20 years ago, you would have been surprised by the little groupings that wander off to do things together. You know, the guys go down the oval and they switch the lights on at night, and you see who's down there playing touch footy or whatever. You think, my goodness, look at that group. There's a little video on our website where we ran pre-pandemic immersion programs, so the boys from overseas would not just do their English language in Sydney, but we would then take them out, for example, out to Trangie, which was a marvellous experience for them. There's the boys with the local Trangie rugby league team examining a football, thinking, oh my goodness, look at this. Those things are what's now coming back, as Ben said, back into the boarding experience for all of them in school. And that's fantastic.
Well, I really want to wrap this conversation up with a question of all of you. Can we it's wonderful to hear of the diversity of cultures in our schools. When we're harnessing that country spirit, can we put a value on that? The asset of these children coming to these schools? And it's a two-pronged question. Is there school spirit without it? Martin, I'll start with you.
Well, as a value, I'd say $12.20. Okay? I've just put a value on it.
But you're gone. Down.
Seriously, though.
No, I'm kidding.
Look, one way of looking at it is that if a person comes to boarding at a school, they're basically paying the same as 2 day students. If a school is strongly committed to boarding, it will find ways to assist parents in various ways to maintain that opportunity. There's a value. There's a value that it is so valuable that the boys, for the parents, it's 2 boys, but for the school to provide things to enable them to come and provide as much assistance as possible across things, there's a very strong value, dollar value. And I know, and Ben would be the same, look, a lot of schools have stopped boarding. And I remember that, and a lot of schools have very tiny boarding and maintain it. I mean, Knox and Kings are bigger, and Kings even bigger because of its traditions. But at the time when school council discussed, do you keep boarding or not, then there is an economic commitment there that is very strong. Boarding is
because of that spirit and culture that those borders bring.
You can have school spirit without borders. Yes, you can. It'd be different.
Yeah.
Put it that way, it would be different. And it would not be as, I'm not going to say not as wholesome, but it is incredibly important to have the rural input into the school spirit, because it is, as Ben said way back there, it's community. Sense of community that these boys bring to the school then infuses into the community as a school, because all of our schools, whether it's Natalie's schools or Ben or something, we're still community schools. I mean, at the base of it, I mean, none of the schools that we try to lose or deliberately lose their community. We're still a community school. And that sense of community is so much stronger in the rural boys that you can place an enormous value on it, engaging the boys. Like, you know, they do travel 600 miles to play footy on a Sunday, right? Well, over in Hong Kong and Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia, they don't.
Yeah.
Right? And so, so there is a value, a very strong value.
And I think what Martin said is so true. Like, it's a reciprocal thing. The country kids do bring a lot, but it's what we get back as well is really, you can't have one without the other, because that's what we want. Why we send them there is for that diversity. And
exactly.
I remember with Archie, him getting a lift to sport one day with a family, and they were like, oh, so what do you do on the farm? He's like, oh, we have sheep, you know, mum's got outback lamb, blah blah blah. And they're like, oh, that's really interesting, and we're vegans. And Archie was like, oh, he says, I've never met a vegan, tell me more. So this is the world we come from, and it's just so rich and diverse. It doesn't matter whether it be your nationality, your food preferences, your sexuality, and like the kids are exposed to so much more, and it's really, that's where you get the bang for your buck.
Yeah, and Fiona's right. In talking about the value of the rural community, then we don't lose sight of the fact that what the other communities are bringing, whether the Vietnamese boys, the Hong Kong boys, Chinese, that mutuality is what is that wasn't there 25 years ago necessarily. It is there now, and it is part of the fabric of modern boarding, and it's incredibly important.
Natalie, what are your thoughts on this?
Funny you said that. I was talking to one of our head of boarding actually last week, and I told her I was doing this, and I said, what do you think the boarding house at St. Peter's would be like without the country kids and girls? And she said, well, I literally can't even imagine it. She said, and I said, can you explain what you mean? And she said, no, I can't. But she said that they bring something. It's important, and it's an important part of the whole community. And I think, I don't know if you can put a value on it, but I certainly see schools, and I think lately, well, we've all seen, I assume it's Australia-wide, the decline of rural kids going to the metropolitan boarding schools. But I have noticed lately a lot of those schools are now trying to pick that, to bring back that cohort. I see them stepping up and advertising a lot more for that, to try and bring that rural cohort in. And I'm not sure how you put a value on that, but obviously it's important to the schools if they're starting to try to bring them back in. And also, but it comes down to cost. Like everyone I talk to, it comes down to the affordability of going to a boarding school, doesn't it? And I think, like Martin was saying, unless schools make opportunities for these kids to get there, they just won't get there.
Yeah.
We risk losing it. And I think, before I throw to you, Ben, that the opportunity that our schools have that have boarding cohorts to keep that connection between urban and country, agriculture, rural, there's often talk on a national scale that we're losing as urban people are losing their connection with the country, understanding where their food and clothing comes from. The opportunity for our schools, our boarding schools, be they large, small, diverse of culture, the opportunity for them to continue these connections, because there's never, 50, 60 years ago, most urban families could say they had a country cousin or a great uncle or a godfather or a godmother. That is decreasing, with population growth. So the opportunity for our schools to continue that and keep our kids, from whether they're urban areas, overseas, new immigrants, connected to our agricultural background, would be great. Ben, can I finish with you?
Yeah, sure. I think I completely agree with Martin in terms of investment, but I think it's our social responsibility to keep these boarding schools up and running, and options for rural families. Now, options meaning financial assistance is definitely conversations that we have and happily have and willingly have with country families. We want to be able to help as many as we possibly can, as Martin would too, to maintain that option for them. So socially, and it is our responsibility as schools and as educators to be able to keep those connections and keep that offer for these country families available within a cost reason. And otherwise, we will end up with boarding houses, sadly, maybe not with the zest of life and the community feel that we have at the moment. And we all see it's intrinsic. You all see the value of it. Monetary wise, I suppose, from our perspective, our school sat probably back in 2010 and made a commitment financially investing in facilities around the school, new boarding houses. They moved all boarding houses one side of a property to another. They upgraded all our facilities. Now, that was a big monetary value. It cost a lot of money, But ultimately, it's a funny sort of situation because the boys would have been happy in the old houses. They just wanted to be together. Whereas parents would want to see, I suppose, a little bit of value for money for their investment. Ultimately, the buildings are empty in the holidays and it's an eerie place, and it's a very strange place. Bring back school term time and they're full of life, and that's what that value is for us. That's where we can see it. We can see boys interacting, families reconnecting, and boys getting on with their education, achieving and trying new things, etc. So I think I understand the question, Amanda, was what the value is. I think Martin answered that really well. I think Fiona and Natalie did too. For us, it's a social responsibility, because that spirit definitely would not be what it is today if we didn't have our country families.
Yeah.
100%.
Oh, sorry, Martin.
All right, I was going to say, look, just on your note about agriculture, I went down the South Coast with my daughter and my granddaughter the other day, just for a couple of days break. And I was on the shore of a lake down there, or the ocean, in terms of one of the bays at Kalala Bay. And some First Nations boys were out there trawling with a net and they caught 2 whiting. And it was really, I love whiting flesh. But they gave us one. And I killed it and gutted it on the beach, took it back to the house and cooked it. And my granddaughter said, "Oh, I won't eat that. I want to go and buy the fish." She was quite happy to help gut it, all that sort of stuff, but she didn't identify that as the fish she bought when they went to a shop.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Isn't it? Yeah. Well, we could talk all day. Thank you so much for your input, and really valuable. And I know that parents listening and watching will really get a lot from it. So thank you, everyone.